Alright, good morning. Kind of a slow start today because I ain't in no hurry. What I've done is brought this engine outside on my stand and I've washed it with kerosene. I like kerosene as a cleaner. It doesn't cause rust. It lubricates a little bit and it'll help wash away all the grit and all the junk. And that's what we want to do. One thing that's very important to me when I wash one up is that I don't get crap done in the bores that when I knock the pistons out, scratches the bores up worse and causes me to have to hone it. What I've done is I've soaked all these with a brush and then I will turn it upside down and wash it. I'm also going to wash it with a pressure washer. I ain't afraid to do that. It'll dry out quick enough. What I don't want to do is push these pistons out and have them cut these bores up and gouge them. Those gouges don't take much to be over what you can hone out, and you start honing too much to get rid of gouges, then you're too big and then your piston skirt slap, causes all kinds of half-assed mess. We don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pressure wash this up. I'm going to air hose it off so it doesn't start to rust, and then I'm going to take it in the shop and I'm going to pull the pistons out, and I'm probably going to use a little bit of oil before I do that too. I've got myself set up here. I've got my tools in an organized fashion where I can work with them. I've got a magnetic butter tray here. It's called a butter dish. You put your parts in and they won't fall on the floor as easily on you. There's two magnets on the bottom and it sticks to what you're working with. For a couple of bucks, that's invaluable. And what I've done here is I've carefully taken a ratchet, and a 12-point socket doesn't always do it. You want to use a 6-point socket. 6-point socket on these nuts and these bolts is much safer without rounding stuff off. Don't use the wrong tool. Okay, now I got the two nuts off of this. I rotated the engine until this cylinder was up here where I could work on it. If you have an engine that's seized and you can't rotate the engine, don't force to rotate it. You do more damage than good. Just work where you can, use extensions and work it, and as you take each one out, you might find that you can turn the engine. Try and take the longest ones last. Okay, so I took these nuts off and I couldn't get this to move. So I had to figure out, how am I going to get this cap off of here? Well, let's take a look at that here. I've got my engine rotated. I took these two nuts off and I couldn't get this cap loose. Don't ever use a steel hammer. I've got a little tiny brass hammer that I can tap to loosen stuff. Don't tap on the threads. Take something wood. Put a piece of wood on it, on the bolt. You can actually start to move that piston down the bore and it will separate that cap right there. Much easier than trying to force or pry the cap loose is to just move the piston away from it. Take the cap off. Now, you're going to notice that right here and right here on the outside of the engine, all the way down on this side, each one of these is stamped. Cylinder number 1, both sides. I'm going to try and get this bearing out right here. The oil sticks to them. I'm going to wait to take that out for a minute. That bearing can stay right where it is. I set the cap over here. I'm going to use my wooden dowel. I'm going to come down here on the bottom side, on the shoulder. I'm going to move that down. Now you'll notice that I'm going to hit right here on the cylinder wall. So I want to move some things around, reposition some things by rotating this a little bit. I can rotate this backwards until this throw is straight up. That will make it much easier for me to line up underneath here and push this straight out the bore. I'm going to catch it with a box so I don't break the cylinder, the piston skirt, or damage anything. I want this stuff to come out unscarred. Let me show you real quick how I'm going to push this out the bore. I've got to make sure that this doesn't come up and hang on the edge of the cylinder as I try to hammer it out. And I'm going to hammer very, very gently. I'm going to come under here, underneath the bolt, and I'm going to position that stick right there. If I have to, I can go on the round part, but everything kind of tends to swirl around in different directions. I like to go under here and rest it on the edge of the engine or the cylinder, find me a spot, and move it down gently. Take my hammer, I'm going to balance that so it's in the right position where I want it. I'm going to tap that down gently, I let it come out the end of the bore, and drop in that box. And there it goes. Now, what we didn't do is drop it in the floor and break these skirts. Okay. Now, you remember what I said about these numbers facing outside the engine on these. The ones over here will be numbered on this side. I'm going to take the cap. First, I'm going to take the bearing that was in there. I'm going to take that bearing, and I am going to set that bearing back inside of there so I can inspect it. I know which half it came off of. I'm going to take this bearing, and I'm going to put it in the cap. You notice they have a little ear and a cut. They only go in one way. I'm going to put that in there loosely. And then I'm going to match these numbers up. You can't put these caps together backwards. That's how everything goes sideways on people, and they spin a bearing and things don't fit and they bind up. They're actually machined one way. They put these together and they machine them out, then they put the bearing inserts in. I'm going to assemble my nuts back on here just finger tight. And then I'm going to go set that over on the bench, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. Okay, over here at my workbench, I laid me out a nice place to work on stuff. I got me a dividing wall to keep all the stuff that way. And I look at this. I put down some cardboard, and I've got a magic marker. This way is the front of the engine. Front of the engine. I got cylinders, because we're working with a Ford, I got cylinders 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If you're doing one of those other brands, you'd have it numbered differently because they number their engines differently. And that's okay. Hell, I'd even build a Corvette motor with Brian if he wanted to. They're neat too. Now, remember we had the piston 1 and 1 bearings, 1 here, and I've also labeled that the numbers go out. I don't need to be turning them around backwards. I've got to make sure that I put this back together right, because on these Ford engines, there is a cut on this side of the crank rod and not one in the middle where they meet. They got to go back in the right way. When you tighten it up, it will not turn. Trust me, I've done that too. Okay, I'm going to interject something here. I was taking these off as I'm going through and taking all these out, and I was taking these nuts off, and I took it off with my speeder, and I went to put my finger under the speeder when I lifted it out, and I dropped the nut. And the nut went, who knows where. So right then I stopped, because we were at a holy crap moment, which is a common thing I say quite often. And that nut went right down in there, right up on that cylinder wall. I went and got a seal pick, and I got a magnet, and I just went ahead and reached inside, held it with the seal pick, got the magnet, and got it out. Because we don't want it going down in that water jacket, never finding it. We need it in the butter dish. So holy crap moments are okay. Sometimes they're kind of amusing. Just stop what you're doing, slow down, take a second, and fix it right then. Don't let it go away and say, I'll get it later. Because if that nut had got down in there in a water jacket or up inside the sleeve and it come back down in here later, going inside everything, we're done. We don't want to be done. We want this thing to run 100,000 miles when we get done. Not have to touch it, just have to change the oil. We have all of our pistons laid out in order according to our label on the table. We know where they came from. They're all pointing in the right direction. And I took a minute and I took each one and I dipped it in my bucket full of kerosene. And I wiped them off a little bit and set them up here. That way any water we had from pressure washing the engine is not going to cause rust. Over here, I've got the motor upside down. And I've got the crank exposed but it's not time to take that out yet. We need to take this pulley off. When you get ready to take this pulley off, you can use a big breaker bar on this nut in here to take it off. But when you do, you'll turn the crank. Everything starts rotating. All it takes is a piece of wood against this edge underneath one of these crank throws to stop that rotating. Just put that in there and make it stop. You'll be able to put your rattle gun on there or your breaker bar and get it off. Alright, in order to get this crank out, we've got to remove this pulley. You're going to end up renting a pulley puller or destroying a pulley, depending on what your choice is. You're going to put the bolt back in without the washer in the center. You're going to use the pulley puller against that bolt without the washer because you'll pry on it forever and it won't come off with the washer in the way. You put that bolt in there and use that pulley puller like you're supposed to. Now this had 3 bolt holes. It had 3 bolt holes. And I only had pullers for 2 bolt holes. So I used a pry bar behind it and a brass hammer, and I tapped it on the other side and I pried it off equally. If you try to cockeye it and do it back and forth, it'll bind up and you never get it off. But I pried it off and tapped it off. The reason why I wasn't real concerned with that is because there is the timing teeth for what's supposed to be like a distributor, because this was a Google motor. This motor still has a distributor hole, and we're going to put a real distributor in it and a real carburetor on it, and we're not going to have the Google. I want no part of the Google on it. So anyway, I removed that, and I'll show you next about this timing cover. Okay, timing cover. It's got all these different bolts in it, all the way around, and they're all different lengths. Be very careful you don't confuse them or mix them up. Okay, I've got all of them loose. Now this bolt right here and this one over here on this side of the water jacket, they have water that passes through them and they're going to be rusted, and those are the ones that are going to break off on you if you're not careful. Remember what I said earlier, PB Blaster is your friend. Soak them for a day if you can, because if you break those off, you got your hands full trying to correct that. Now this piece is made out of aluminum. It's the timing chain cover, and on the outside of that bolts your aluminum water pump. There's 2 pieces put together here. You'll notice that when I get ready to remove this, it doesn't want to come loose. Well, what do? Do not stick something in the corners and pry on it. You will goof up a gasket edge. And do not use a hammer unless you use, holy crap, look what I got. A plastic edged hammer, a rubber headed hammer, and what's called a dead blow hammer. These don't do damage. You just take this hammer, come up alongside and knock it loose, which I did a minute ago. And then you should be able to pull this whole thing off. It's got some dowel pins. You should be able to pull this whole assembly off like that. And you want to leave them bolts in those holes if you can, because who knows where they go back in the puzzle. So I just set that over there on the bench and leave that as is for now. And we got here timing chain. Timing chain is loose. This engine is starting to tell us a story. We don't know how many miles are on it, but I'm going to show you how to assess that later. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this bolt off and this washer and set them aside. They're very important that they stay here. When I do that, I can take this gear and this gear together off with the chain. You can't take the chain off. They got to slide off together, and they'll come off in your hands and everything be groovy. Okay, we finally made it to the point where we get to do something exciting, and that is to take these off. The main bearing caps. Now when you take a main bearing cap loose, you want to use a 6-point socket that fits exactly. You don't want to have any slippage. You want a nice socket. If you have to borrow a set or go buy a set of 1/2-inch drive 6-point sockets, you need to do so. Don't do anything but use a nice breaker bar and a 6-point socket to take these off and to put them back on with a torque wrench. Put one hand down flush, get yourself stable, and you want to pull, and you want to hear a popping sound when it comes loose. That's when it breaks its torque. There it went. And you want to feel it. Make sure something's not shearing off when you're doing it. Okay. Now I've done the rest of them. Loosened all these bolts, and I'll make sure they're going to come up out of the holes. This one has a stud on it that holds on the oil tube that goes to the rear of the pan to draw the oil out and carry it in a tube up the side to the oil pump. These have already been in their own home. Each bolt has been in its own home. We don't want to make them move, so we're going to keep them all together and put them right back where they came out of. You'll notice that these caps, one and a pyramid, teepee, Indian, arrow, something there, point to the front of the engine. 2, point to the front of the engine. 3, point to the front of the engine. 4, point to the front of the engine. 5 is not labeled. It has a code on it for manufacturer and what motor this is. Take my rubber hammer. I'm going to knock that cap sideways. You can tap the bolts if they're not in the threads. That one won't move. That one will. The reason this one won't is because it's a thrust bearing. Hit it on the side. Each side a little bit until it pops loose. And the back one the same way. The back one's got some RTV on it. And you're dealing with an oil seal as well on that. There it comes. Gentle persuasion without damage. I'm going to take these off, set these in order. Okay. Once we get these all set in order, we're going to lift the crank out. I'm going to pick that bolt up before I do anything else, and I'm going to cut film for a second. Okay, now I set all these over here on my little board in order, nice and neat, and I made sure that the bearing inserts were still inside of each one. I'm going to take this crank, I'm going to pick it up off these bearings. I've got a seal back here. This is a one-piece rear main seal. You pop that out with your hand. Take that off. There it is. That's your oil seal. When somebody says my rear main went out and it was spraying oil everywhere, that's what fails. You want to take this crank out without dropping or damaging those bearings. Go set it down on a bench very carefully. And I'm going to come back in a minute. We're going to look at these bearings before we pull them out, and we're going to set them over there in order so we can assess what was going on with the oil pressure of this engine and how many miles it might have on it. I've wiped these clean with kerosene on a rag and with a dry rag. And I'm looking at these bearings and the finish on them. This is the crank that turns right down the center, these bearings. And you can see where it's starting to wear a little bit in here. When these bearings wear, the more they wear, they will start to show a coppery or a brass color. This is the first layer that's on the bearing. You can see where it's wearing in some places and not others. We call that loading. That's where the bearing is taking stress in one spot or another more than another. This is a side thrust bearing. The one in the middle, number 3 on this engine, keeps the crank from shifting forward and back. And you have to have a specified tolerance so the crank can move so many thousandths, but not anymore. These bearings look pretty good. Kind of surprised. And look at that. There's kind of a hint and a clue there we'll get to in a few minutes. I'm going to very quickly show reading some of these bearings. You have to remember what we showed a second ago was on the top side of the motor underneath. Now this bearing here shows more wear because this part's on the bottom and the crank is pushing down. When the piston has this explosion and it starts its downward force down, developing horsepower and pushing torque, it pushes the crank out of the bottom of the engine. So this is the half that shows you more wear than the other one. And this one's showing a little bit of scuffing, but it's still got all its material. Number 3, the thrust bearing we talked about, does as well. But what is that line right there? I can feel that with my fingernail, and it's rough. This side here is starting to show a little bit of copper or brass right in this section. And none on this side. So the crank was trying to work its way forward a little bit. And then I looked at number 4. 4 is experiencing a problem. It's showing some copper or some brassy color there, and there's a big gouge in it. And number 5 has got a problem too. This is a gouge I can really feel. Some people will say, well, this is minor. This is minor. Well, it is. It's wear and tear on a motor. But something went through here. A contaminant, a piece of debris, a piece of dirt, something that got past the filter, a piece of metal filing that came off. Something went through there and caused some damage. Well, when you start to lose the tolerance between the bearing and the piece that's turning in it, you start to lose oil pressure. Now we want to start looking at the crank and finding out where that groove is on the crank too. And there's a groove on it from that. And this one's a little rougher here. I can feel it. This one's a little smoother. This line in the center is where you have two rods working against each other. That's just a wear mark. That's nothing to be concerned with there. This one goes on this half, and over here this cylinder comes over on this one. But you want to feel that for roughness and see what's going on with it. More fun facts. This thrust bearing came out of the center. I've got it aside. And then I've got a half of another bearing. And then I've got one of these I removed out of here to look at. All the bearings have dates on them. They have a design date and a manufacture date. This thrust bearing has a date code on it. F4. Well, F is a decade and 4 is a year. So this bearing was designed or put into production, the design of it, in 1994. So, we know we don't have an old motor if we got those bearings in it. This bearing is a C5. Wait a minute. C5? That's a 1975 design bearing. Wow. Okay. But there's a date of manufacture too. 96. This bearing was made in 96. They've been using the same rod bearing design or main bearing design for those bearings since 1975, and they're happy with it. What I was able to concurrently find out in here is that all these that have gone through, this motor is most likely stock, has never been opened since it was new. Manufactured at the factory and has not been opened or had any work done inside of it. We've nearly got this whole engine stripped down. We've got to the exciting part. Excuse me. Everybody talks about, oh, what about the cam? What about the cam? Okay, well, there's a camshaft in it. Now listen to these bolts here, 7/16, very carefully. They're small and they shear off if you're not careful. And they're also thread locked in. When you put them back in, you're going to thread lock them because they don't take very much torque as small as they are. You can't over torque them. You'll break them off in the block and then you get yourself a real problem. Anyway, that's called a thrust plate. Fords have a thrust plate, Chevys do it different. And there's a spot there oil travels, that spot, and it even says back. It goes towards the back of the block. Okay, set that aside. I'm going to take this bolt out. I'm going to take a long bolt. I'm going to thread a long bolt in there where that one was so that I can handle this and pull it out properly. I'll show you here. There's just a set of bearings that it goes in, and you need to kind of keep it level to get past each one as you come out. Take out the camshaft. Each one comes past each bearing. You got to hold it centered. And there's your camshaft. We will assess that in a minute. All right, now we're going to have a technical moment where I talk about the flux capacitor, and I probably need to get my girlfriend to get me a white lab coat with a pocket protector and get my glasses, put my serious glasses on down over my nose, and say, now I'm going to show you all the scientific high dollar number stuff and everything else here. But anyway, I'm going to use some measuring tools. I'm going to show you how to measure the lift on a cam in hand. You have to use a degree wheel and have the cam in the motor to measure duration and overlap. We can cover that later when we reassemble. I'll show you how to measure just the basic lift. You know what kind of cam you got, you take a guess and look it up that way. Earlier we were talking about using a set of calipers to measure stuff. look what I've got here. I got me a set of micrometers. They're not really expensive, but man, do I feel like a mad scientist when I got a set of them. I'm going to show you real fast what I did. I took the micrometers, learned how to read them. That was a tough one. And I took the cam. The cam's got these lobes on it, these egg-shaped lobes. There we go. Okay, and when you measure, you want to get two measurements. You want to get a measurement of the tallest part, or the lobe, and then you want to get a measurement of what's called the base circle, which is down here. So you just measure across the base circle, which is just 0, where that valve is closed and that lifter is riding on it, and then you get a measurement of the widest part, the lobe, and that's how much that little bump right there opens the valve. So I took my calipers and I measured here first. I wrote it down. I measured 3 times, and then I measured here 3 times, and I wrote it down. And the measurements that I came up with, the lobe measures 1.717 inches high or wide. That's the lobe, the lift. Then I subtracted the base circle, which is 1.438. I came up with 0.279. Then I multiplied that by 1.6 because we use a 1.6 rocker ratio in the motor, and you multiply that, and that gives you the lift of this cam is approximately 0.446 of an inch. So that is a 446. I also compared an intake one to an exhaust one, and an intake one to an exhaust one. And I just kind of passed this set of micrometers all the way down to the bottom. And it appeared that the back 2 or 3 or 4 were just a little bit worn compared to the ones in the front, which tells us the same thing as the bearings. Maybe the back of the motor wasn't getting enough oil. And that was not a 440 lift stock cam. We'll talk about that another day. That was my son in his car. When he left, he didn't turn it loose. He was just driving it easy. Cam can make a lot of difference, but I'll tell you what really makes a big difference in a motor when you build them right is compression. You got to get as much compression as you can get and still run the gas you want to run without detonation or pre-ignition. His engine's on the verge of it. He's 1075 compression, but his cam is relieving some of it, and that comes into play with the way the overlap of the valves is and the duration and how that fits in with the timing in relationship to the crank, and we can go in about that. But you can do so much by those combinations of those numbers and that math, and getting your glasses down on your face and wearing your pocket protector and using your slide rule and being a mad scientist about it. And you can make things behave exactly the way you want them to. His car gets 19 miles a gallon on the highway, and he's over 400 horsepower, and it's just about as fast as any new Mustang I've seen. And he loves it. It's high school cool. Let's do one last thing today. Let's look at these cylinder bores. It's going to be kind of hard to see, but I'm going to try to light it up. We're going to get down in here close. You can see the faintness of the X pattern, the crosshatch pattern. That X-y sanded looking pattern in there, that is where they honed the bore when they built the engine. Now, you can see down there where the skirt was rubbing, and up there where the skirt was rubbing, and a little bit of oil and contamination was there. One thing that you do when you look at these is you check this spot right up here where the ring comes to the top of the bore. Right there, that top ring on the piston. There's the shadows of the other rings where they were stopping. It doesn't come any higher than that. That ring stops right there. And you want to take that spot and you want to feel that with your fingernail and see if there's a lip there. Let me try to hold the light with my mouth. you know, I don't feel a lip on that. And that tells me that that cylinder didn't wear into an egg shape. Cylinders will actually get egg shaped where that piston goes up and down and rocks back and forth when it comes up and down, and they call that taper. And one of the things we want to get a measurement on is we want to measure and see if this is still a cylinder or if it's bigger at the bottom down here than it is up here. And also if there's that wear edge there. And there's not a wear edge, or I would have had to really beat my pistons to get that ring to come past that little lip there. I might even have had to sand that first before I could get them out. So this engine does not possibly have a lot of wear on it. Miles, I don't know. I was disappointed in the way the timing chain was, but we'll have to see. Okay, the last step of our assessment. I took a piston and I cleaned it up. And I took all the rings off of it. Okay. Now I've got this piston, I washed everything, washed off my kerosene, wiped it down, and I used a wire brush and cleaned up the carbon and everything so it's clean. Then I took the top ring that was on this piston and I fitted it in the cylinder bore. Then I took the piston very gently and I put it up against it and pushed it down in the bore until I got close to the bottom of the stroke. The piston will square up the ring so I can get a proper measurement on it. So there it is down there, and you can see that gap at the top where the ends of the ring don't quite meet. That's called your gap. Then I'm going to take feeler gauges. I'm going to take feeler gauges and I'm going to find the one that fits in there. And I'm going to measure that and write that down. However many thousandths feeler gauge fits in there with the right amount of drag through that gap. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to move that ring up to the top of the bore. Okay, I'm going to bring it up here to the top. And then I'm going to put this piston in there and I'm going to square it up again just so at the top. And then I'm going to get a measurement with that ring up at the top of the bore. And the gap that it opens, the bottom and the top will tell me if that cylinder bore is tapered or not, like a cone. That would show the wear in a cylinder that would be unacceptable if it's over too many thousandths taper. This is a layman's way of measuring. They have a gauge you can buy that you put in there, it has a dial indicator on it, you run it up and down the bore and it shows you taper. That's one way to do it. And you got some other stuff, but this is the way to do it with what we've got in hand. We're going to do that, and then as soon as I get those numbers and everything, I'll be all finished, and I will come back tomorrow and we'll get the results of that. But we'll talk about what we think we can do with the engine and how far we can get without having to pay a machinist a bunch of money and without having to do any unnecessary work. See if we can build a good running engine out of this.